So, the book I've chosen to read is Nevermore, The Trials of Morrigan Crow. It's the first in a trilogy, I think, but I'm sure that there are going to be more coming out. So the author is Jessica Townsend. I think she's got loads of other great books as well. So I'm going to be reading chapter 6, which is Morningtide. Morrigan held her breath as the cat's fish-sized amber eyes scanned her up and down. Finally, it turned and slunk back inside. Morrigan tried to retreat, but Jupiter nudged her through the doorway. She looked up at him, puzzled. Was it a trick? Had he saved her from the hunt of smoke and shadow, only to feed her to his giant cat? Very funny, Jupiter said to the animal's hulking backside as it led them down a long, narrow, dimly lit hallway. I hope you've got my breakfast on, you matted old brute. How long have we got? 6.5 minutes, the cat called back to him. You're cutting it stupidly fine, as usual. Do take those disgusting boots off before you go walking mud across the lobby, won't you? Jupiter kept one hand on Morrigan's shoulder, steering her straight ahead. Gas lanterns and sconces on the wall were turned low. It was hard to see much, but the carpet looked shabby and worn, and the wallpaper peeled in places. There was a faint smell of damp. They reached a steep wooden staircase and began to climb. This is the service entrance. Ghastly, I know. Needs some fixing up, said Jupiter, and Morrigan realised with a start that he was speaking to her. How did he know what she was thinking? Any messages, Fen? The cat turned to look at him as they reached a set of glossy black double doors at the top of the landing, and Morrigan could have sworn it rolled its eyes. How should I know? I'm not your secretary. I said take off those boots. With a thrust of its big grey head, the cat pushed open the doors, and they stepped into the most magnificent room Morrigan had ever seen. The lobby of the Hotel Decalion was cavernous and bright, which came as a surprise after the dim, threadbare service entrance. Although as surprises go, it wasn't quite in the same league as being greeted at the door by a large talking cat. The floor was made of checkerboard black and white marble, and from the ceiling hung an enormous rose-coloured chandelier in the shape of a sailing ship, dripping with crystals and bursting with warm light. There were potted trees and elegant furniture all around. A grand staircase curved around the walls, up and up to 13 floors. Morrigan crowded them in a dizzying spiral. You can't tell me what to do. I pay your wages, Jupiter grumbled, but he took off his travelling boots anyway. A young man collected them and handed Jupiter a pair of polished black shoes, which he reluctantly put on. I think I chose that section of chapter 6 because I can really relate to Morrigan's sense of amazement and wonder at having thought she was about to die and then suddenly being transported to this magical place, which I just think it would have blown my mind if it was me in that position. But yeah, thank you. Bye.
Hello and welcome. I'll be reading Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, written by J.K. Rowling. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck. Although he did have a very large moustache, Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister. But they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband was un-Dursleyish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say about the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull grey Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out the most boring type of work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled the screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4 Privet Drive. It was the corner of the street that he noticed the sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map? For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he be thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner, up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave him a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. That is all I'll be reading for now. Thank you for listening. Bye!
Happy World Book Day. My name's Amelia and I'm going to be talking about one of my favourite books of all time, When Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit by Judith Kerr. I haven't read this book for years, but its endearing qualities are so distinctive and timeless for anyone who wishes to read this brilliant book. The book is semi-autobiographical, referring to a Jewish family who flee Berlin on the eve of the German election result in 1933, 6 years before World War II began. At the time, the Nazis were rising to power, and therefore this Jewish family and many, many others like them were threatened. Judith Kerr writes in the précis, "This is the start of a huge adventure, sometimes frightening, very often funny, and always, always exciting." I think that you should read this book because it has a very fundamental storyline and one that hopefully none of us will ever have to fully comprehend. This book helps us remember how fortunate we are, which can easily be forgotten at times. As the distinguished author Michael Morpurgo writes, the most life-enhancing book you could ever wish to read. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you read the book one day and have a good World Book Day.
Hi, my name is Evie Pace, and I'm here to read to you a passage from my favourite book, The Book Thief, by Markus Zusak, in honour of World Book Day, which is happening this Thursday the 4th. This time, when he came back, he said, "Actually, I've a better idea." In his hand, there was a thick painter's pencil and a stack of sandpaper. "Let's start from scratch." Liesl saw no reason to argue. In the left corner of an upturned piece of sandpaper, he drew a square of perhaps an inch and shoved a capital A inside of it. In the other corner, he placed a lowercase one. So far, so good. A, Liesl said. A for what? She smiled. Apfel. He wrote the word in big letters and drew a misshapen apple under it. He was a house painter, not an artist. When it was complete, he looked over and said, now for B. As they progressed through the alphabet, Liesl's eyes grew larger. She had done this at school in the kindergarten class, but this time it was better. She was the only one there, and she was not gigantic. It was nice to watch Papa's hand as she wrote the words and slowly constructed the primitive sketches. I urge you to read this book if you honestly want to feel the emotions that Liesl Memminger goes through as she faces the hardships of war-torn Germany. Liesl goes through a great deal to borrow books to fuel her obsession with reading, as it gives her hope in one of the most darkest moments of modern history.
Marcus couldn't believe it. Dead. A dead duck. Okay, he'd been trying to hit it on the head with a piece of sandwich, but he tried to do all sorts of things, and none of them had ever happened before. He'd tried to get the highest score on the stargazing machine in the kebab shop on Hornsey Road. Nothing. He'd tried to read Nicky's thoughts by staring at the back of his head every maths lesson for a week. Nothing. It really annoyed him that the only thing he'd ever achieved through trying was something he hadn't really wanted that much in the first place. And anyway, since when did hitting a bird with a sandwich ever kill it? Kids must spend half their lives throwing things at the ducks in Regent's Park. How can we manage to pick a duck that pathetic? There must have been something wrong with it. It was probably just about to die from a heart attack or something. It was just a coincidence. But if it was, nobody would believe him. If there are any witnesses, they'd only have seen the bread hit the duck right on the back of the head and then seen it keel over. They'd put 2 and 2 together and make 5, and he'd be in prison for a crime he never committed. Will, Susie, Megan and Marcus stood on the path at the edge of the lake, staring at the dead body floating in the water. There's nothing we can do about it now, said Will, the trendy bloke who was trying to impress Susie. Just leave it. What's the problem? Well, supposing someone saw me. Do you think anyone did? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe they said they were going to tell the park keeper. Maybe someone saw you, or definitely. Maybe they said they were going to get the park keeper, or definitely. Marcus didn't like this bloke, so he didn't answer him.
Hi, I'm Izzy. I'm going to be reading a section from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is my favourite childhood book by Roald Dahl. I'm going to be reading the section where Charlie has just found out that he's found one of the 5 golden tickets and he's just come home to tell his parents. Chapter 12. What it said on the golden ticket. Charlie burst through the front door shouting, "Mother, mother, mother!" Mrs. Bucket was in the old grandparents' room serving them their evening soup. "Mother!" yelled Charlie, rushing in on them like a hurricane. "Look, I've got it! Look, Mother, look! The last golden ticket! It's mine! I found some money in the street and I bought 2 bars of chocolate and the second one had the golden ticket. There were crowds of people all around me wanting to see it and the shopkeeper rescued me and I ran all the way home and here I am. It's the 5th golden ticket, Mother, and I found it!" Mrs. Bucket simply stood and stared, while the 4 grandparents, who were sitting up in their bed balancing their bowls of soup on their laps, all dropped their spoons with a clatter and froze against their pillows. For about 10 seconds there was absolute silence in the room. Nobody dared to speak. It was a magic moment. Then, very softly, Grandpa Joe said, "You're pulling our legs, Charlie, aren't you? You're having a little joke." "No, I'm not," cried Charlie, rushing up to the bed and holding out the large and beautiful golden ticket for him to see. Grandpa Joe leaned forward and took a close look, his nose almost touching the ticket. The others watched him, waiting for the verdict.